a young boy was playing an online RPG and strategy game on his computer. Even while he was hospitalized, out of nowhere, his body felt heavy and everything went black. His mind was swept away, sinking to the depths of an imaginary ocean, until suddenly, he woke up in a forest filled with cool air and overcast skies. Seated on a stone throne, to top it off, a woman stepped forward, addressing him as if she'd been waiting for him to wake up. As she emerged from the shadows, the boy immediately recognized her. It was none other than Atu, an elf who called him king. The game he'd been playing while bedridden was a dark fantasy 4X strategy simulator called Eternal Nations, and the character he loved most, the one standing before him now, was this very elf. Now, he couldn't help but wonder, should he act like the king she claimed he was? It was clear she saw him as the leader of Minagra. Sensing his confusion, the girl smiled and said, "It's all right, Takuto." After all, he'd beaten Nightmare difficulty using what was considered the hardest civilization in the game, the ruined civilization, Minagra. Because of that, Era Takuto became the legendary player at the very top of the global leaderboard. Atu, for her part, remembered every moment they'd played together, how they had conquered the world side by side time and again, so there was no need for him to worry. She knew exactly who he was. Thinking back, Takuto realized Atu matched his own playstyle. Maybe because he'd always wanted to be as strong as she was. Tears welled up in his eyes as he admitted how happy he was to finally speak to his favorite character. She said she felt the same. Takuto asked if this was heaven, and if Atu was the one who'd brought him here. But she explained that she, too, had simply appeared in this place out of the blue, and it didn't seem much like paradise. If anything, she thought, it felt more like the world of Eternal Nations. No doubt about it, she said, it was a miracle, and it was a true honor to meet her master in person. With that, the elf knelt before the boy, took his hand, and invited him to start again, just the two of them, building a kingdom of their own. As tempting as the offer was, Takuto was still lost in confusion. Even so, with his loyal companion by his side, maybe this was his chance to relive those golden days in this new world. So, Takuto called on his servant to begin their journey together. Atu introduced herself as the child born from the mud who would bring destruction to the world, declaring that, from now on, her body and mind belonged solely to her master. Hearing this over-the-top speech, Takuto cringed with secondhand embarrassment. He realized how much harder it was to say such things in real life than it was in the game, and Atu admitted it was a little embarrassing for her too. Still, the king decided to play along, calling the elf his first and only subordinate, his confidant and right hand. Their civilization, infamous for being ruthless, but also meticulous and highly skilled in internal affairs. Then Takuto asked if his servant knew what Minagra's first move should be, and, in perfect sync, the two replied, "Let's go into hiding." Next, Takuto summoned a scout using emergency production. Without delay, a creature known as a long-legged insect crawled out of a portal, a sight both Takuto and Atu found a bit gross, if they were being honest. Still, Takuto reminded himself that Minagra was a civilization of moderation that wielded evil and ruin, so they'd need to keep that in mind as they acted. For Atu, that meant they had to do everything possible to avoid revealing their true identities. First things first, the king ordered the insect to scout the area without being seen. Watching the insect scuttle off, Takuto realized he could see through its eyes. Summoning that scout had cost him 100 mana, leaving him with 100 more. Setting up a settlement, a base of operations, would take another 20. Atu pointed out that emergency production was expensive, so they should be careful with their spending. Takuto admitted he really wanted to create a warrior to defend them, but that would probably drain all his mana. Speaking of combat, the elf pledged to do her best, or, at least, that's what she wanted to say, if she weren't so weak right now. Takuto understood. Atu was a hero unit who got stronger over time, but at the moment her strength was only 3 less than even some basic enemies. In short, their entire plan to build Minagra was at serious risk if they were attacked by pretty much anything. Using the scout's vision, Takuto surveyed the land around them forest, as far as the eye could see. So far, there were no monsters in sight. Atu thought the forest was a perfect place to hide, but she found it strange that the long-legged insect hadn't spotted a single animal along the way. Even worse, Takuto realized there was nothing at all to eat. All they could do was stay alert and hope something turned up. Atu apologized for not being more helpful, but the boy told her that just having her company was more than enough, making her eyes shine with joy. Seeing her so moved, he thought to himself how hard it had been to notice these little things in the game. But Atu Lamacenta's personality really was just like this. Putting that aside, through the scout's eyes, Era Takudo soon discovered a community of dark elves not far away. Takudo explained that this type of elf tended to be neutral, maybe leaning a bit toward evil, which, honestly, was a relief. At the very least, it confirmed that they really were in the world of eternal nations. On the downside, if there was another civilization settlement nearby, it could spell trouble. Avoiding war at the start of the game was crucial. So, their top priority was to find a safe place to settle, but before that, they needed to keep an eye on the Dark Elves and gather more information about the area. If things went south, they'd just have to make a run for it. Suddenly, speak of the devil, a small group of dark elves appeared before the stone throne where Minagra's two companions sat. Earlier that day, the same group was making its way through the forest. One elf turned to Gia, their leader, and said they should just leave the cursed lands. There was no point in leaving the woods now. But Gia reminded them that they had already been exiled from their homeland, they had nowhere else to go. And honestly, their children wouldn't survive much longer under these conditions. Considering how lush the place was, there had to be food somewhere. A female elf pointed out that at the edge of the unexplored territory of Idaragia, there stood the vast, accursed forest, the cursed lands. All the books said something evil had been sealed there. Whatever it was, it would never allow life to flourish. Gia brushed this off, telling Emily that it was just superstition. The trees were clearly growing just fine. With that, the leader insisted no one could give up now, not at such a critical moment, and reminded them that their proud spirits and the ghosts of their ancestors would surely guide them through this hardship. Still, after these motivating words, Gia couldn't deny that the forest was truly frightening. But curse or not, that wasn't an excuse to leave. His people still had hope. As long as they had the strength, finding food was the priority. And that's how the band of dark elves found Minagra's two founders seated on the stone throne. To them, Era Takudo was nothing more than a shadowy, sinister figure, a vision so terrifying it made Gia break out in a cold sweat. Convinced he was witnessing evil incarnate, knowing his actions could decide the fate of his entire race, Gia gathered himself and stepped forward. Bowing before the figure on the throne, he introduced his companions as members of the Mazaram clan. His own name was Gia Najiv, the leader of their warriors, and he apologized for entering the forest without permission from what appeared to be the land's master. With a chilling expression, Atu Lamacenta recognized that this dark fairy truly understood the gravity of trespassing here, but wanted to know the reason behind it. Gia explained that their clan once lived in Idaragia, but they'd been persecuted and forced to flee into the forest. He tried to tell their whole story, but Atu pressed him to keep it brief, making Gia more and more anxious, not wanting to make a mistake that would put his people at risk. Amidst this, Takudo commented on how thin the dark elves looked, and Gia admitted, with a heavy heart, that they hadn't found any food in this place so far. Honest about his feelings, the dark elf wondered why his clan had to endure so much suffering, when all they wanted was a peaceful place to live. Out of nowhere, the supposed master of the shadowy forest offered him a handful of apples. Takudo mentioned that these taste delicious if you cut them into the shape of a rabbit. Gia had never seen fruit like this before, and wondered if it would be rude to try one on the spot. But the rest of his group was too hungry for such concerns. They bit into the apples, smiles spreading across their faces as the sweet, juicy flavor hit them. But that wasn't all. Takudo opened a portal and handed out pears as well. Gia bowed even lower, saying there were others like them who'd also escaped into these lands, including small, starving children. So, instead of eating now, Gia asked for permission to take the fruit back to the others. Takudo listened, felt sorry for them, and handed over even more food, this time with bread, vegetables, and greens too. Witnessing what seemed like a miracle, Gia Najiv reflected on how the dark elves had always been despised as outcasts from the light, barely tolerated thanks only to the mercy of the so-called fairies of light. Marked by scorn, Gia's people were forced to live in the shadows, and no one had ever reached out to help them in their darkest moments. Overwhelmed by such power and mercy, Najiv of the Mazaram clan finally dared to ask, who was this individual sitting on the throne? Meanwhile, back at the Dark Elf settlement, those who hadn't traveled were doing their best to bear the hunger that haunted the community. Then, suddenly, the foraging party returned, their leader grinning from ear to ear with the best news anyone could hope for. The famine was finally over. With all that food, joy swept through the whole village, and Gia watched the scene, deeply satisfied. When asked how he'd managed to find so much, he simply answered that he stumbled upon it, all while the ominous figure of Era Takudo lingered in his mind. Later that night, while the community slept, Najiv sat by a campfire, The old elder Molter came over to compliment the chief on his work. Molter said he'd lived a long life, but never, in all those years, had he seen such strange and delicious fruit. Najeeb agreed he'd never even heard of food like this either, and that was exactly why the old man wanted to know what had led the Mazaram clan to such unusual circumstances. Ready to share the truth, Jia said he'd met a legendary being deep in the forest. According to Imlay, there was a legend about a being sealed away in the cursed lands. Molter was stunned, wondering if the expedition party had encountered the Ruin King, a figure found, at least in part, in old books and stories. When the world reached its limit, the Ruin King would appear, bringing devastation to all, forcing people to start over from zero. As much as no one could say for sure if this would ever come to pass, it was also impossible to say the legend was just a lie. Jia, for his part, never caught the being's name, but he had to admit that frightening appearance fit the title of Ruin King all too well. The entity was simply beyond comprehension, but at least he had a servant who could clarify his words to some extent. Whatever the case may be, even if there's no certainty whether this entity is truly the King of Ruin, Molter senses that it's nothing good. Now that his stomach and a bit of his mana are replenished, the elder can feel it clearly. This forest is far from normal. He wonders if Jia might have given something to the entity in exchange for the food, but the chief insists that isn't the case. Molter doesn't buy it. He argues that the King of Ruin would never do a good deed without expecting something in return, but Jia swears there was no price at all, no strings attached. According to him, it genuinely seemed to be an act of mercy from that spirit. His Grace, as Jia calls him, saw the dire situation the Dark Elves were in and showed them compassion. Hearing this, Elder Molter is infuriated that Jia would refer to the King of Ruin as His Grace and starts to suspect that the leader of Mazaram must have fallen under the entity's spell. That's when an argument breaks out between these two pillars of the community. Jia insists that they owe the utmost respect to someone who fed their people when they were on the brink of starvation. In fact, he turns the question back on the elder, asking what he would have done in the presence of the King of Ruin. But even Molter can't come up with an answer to that, so he apologizes for his outburst to the bravest warrior of their tribe. From here on out, he declares, as the head of the Mazaram Dark Elves, he'll personally handle matters with the King of Ruin. After all, Molter has lived for 2 centuries, he's sure he can figure something out. In the end, all these two leaders want is for their people to find peace again. Meanwhile, back with Minagra's so-called founders, Atu scolds her master for blowing through a bunch of mana to feed the Dark Elves, reminding him that they need to start building their own nation, and that means conserving magic. Takudo, a little sheepish despite his charitable act, admits that he needs his companion now more than ever. Hearing this, Atu drops her tough act and slips into a weirdly love-struck, submissive mode, as if a single kind word from her master is enough to make her melt completely. Takudo, meanwhile, laments that he just couldn't manage to communicate properly with the Dark Elves. No matter how hard he tried, the words just wouldn't come out. Atu confesses she thought he was just trying to act like a mysterious mastermind who hates long speeches and lets his subordinates handle the details. But the truth is, the kid genuinely isn't much of a communicator. Honestly, he never was in his previous life, and it's not like he was suddenly going to become a master of rhetoric and charisma overnight. The next day, Elder Molter asks the young leader if he's ready to return to the place where the King of Ruin awaits. Once the young elf agrees, the experienced elder grows concerned about what that entity might want in exchange for helping their people. Even though Najeeb insists she never mentioned any kind of payment, the old elf knows all too well. Evil beings always expect some sort of reward. Regardless, he understands the Dark Elves need the king's help to survive. Jia agrees, pointing out that even if they left the forest in search of food, they might still return empty-handed. Speaking of leaving the forest, Molter reminds them that one of their hopes is for the clan to reach the Dark Continent and find a kingdom where they won't be hunted. Maybe that's their last chance. With that said, both leaders agree on one thing: the fate of their people rests in their hands. Meanwhile, the insect serving Takudo was listening to every word of their conversation. The scout quickly returns to his master to report that the Dark Elves would be arriving soon. Atu already suspected the elves wouldn't be able to carry all the food they'd received in a single trip. Takudo, on his part, points out that having people with different cultures and technologies nearby could easily lead to conflict. In fact, he'd prefer if they just took the rest of the food and left as soon as possible. The truth is, he worries he won't be able to negotiate with the elves because of his communication problem, which could cause misunderstandings down the line. Seeing this, Atu offers to handle negotiations on her master's behalf. which would also serve to elevate the king's grandeur. As night falls, Gia Najib arrives before the King of Ruin, accompanied by the tribe's elder, who introduces himself as Molter Cordal Mazaram, leader of the Dark Elves. Before anything else, Molter expresses his gratitude for the king's generosity in providing food to his people, then asks for the honor of learning his great name. Cautiously, Atu looks at the king, who gives a nod of approval. Taking the cue, she introduces him as Era Takudo, Lord of the Apocalypse, Sovereign of Ruin, and demands he be addressed as formally as possible, leaving Najib visibly impressed. Atu also introduces herself, and Molter vows to engrave both their names into the very soul of his people. Quietly observing, Takudo thinks everything is going smoothly so far, and Atu tells the elves they can take their food and leave. Molter then asks how he might repay the King of Ruin for his aid, but the elf woman immediately waves it off, insisting they could never possibly offer anything worthy of the king's greatness. Besides, since the Mazaram clan has nothing valuable enough to match such generosity, Atu interprets this as a suspicious attitude, which makes the exchange tense. She questions whether the elves are planning something behind this empty talk. Sensing the tension in the air, Takudo whispers a few things into his servant's ear. She snaps, grumbling that these elves are terrible negotiators and that if they don't leave the king alone, they'll only cause trouble and so should be annihilated. Raising her voice, Atu declares their heads would look perfect mounted on pillars. Takudo, meanwhile, urges everyone to calm down, guessing the Mazaram just want to build a relationship that benefits everyone. So maybe it's best to accept some form of compensation just to set their minds at ease. With that, Atu turns to the Dark Elves and announces the king is willing to accept a token of gratitude for his charity. As relief washes over the Mazaram's faces, Takudo realizes the elder must have suspected a catch, considering the King of Ruin's evil alignment. Picking up on these unspoken cues, Atu calls the old man a fool for thinking Era Takudo is some wicked ghost or malevolent spirit. Setting that aside, since she has no idea what to actually ask for in return, she thinks for a moment and decides it would be good to hear everything the Dark Elves know about the world beyond the forest. Molter offers to share all his knowledge, and Atu demands that the Mazaram clan leave the forest once their pact is fulfilled. Gia Najib is clearly shaken by this demand, and Takudo immediately sees he's much easier to read than the elder. Molter admits nothing would make his clan happier than being allowed to stay in the forest, but Atu won't allow it. Moreover, if the Mazaram want to keep the lives that were spared, they mustn't speak of what happened here. Faced with the weight of this ultimatum, Gia seems ready to protest, but Molter calms him and resumes the negotiations, expressing gratitude for the audience with the king and agreeing to everything Atu laid out. As the Dark Elves depart, Takudo wonders if this is truly the right thing to do. If the Mazaram are exiled, it's likely they'll collapse somewhere along the way, and surely they won't just stand by and watch their own downfall, knowing exile might well mean death. With this on his mind, the King of Ruin extends his hand and invites the elves to become his subjects. Outraged, Atu asks what on earth the king is thinking. He explains he was considering using the refugee system. After all, Dark Elves aren't inherently good or evil, but if they're accepted as refugees into the civilization Takudo plans to build, and if things work like they did in the game, the elves would eventually become evil like them. Atu agrees that it's possible for beings of different evil alignments to coexist, but points out that Dark Elves are nothing like Minagra's main citizens, the homunculi, which could create friction. Takudo admits it's risky, but asks Atu to remember what the homunculi look like, and whether she could handle living with only those creatures as citizens, admitting it's impossible to put up with their ugliness and stupidity for all eternity. Atu turns to the Mazaram and announces her master's intention to soon found a nation. If the elves are willing to become citizens, they'll be protected by the king and promised eternal happiness. Last but not least, Lamisanta lays it all out. The Dark Elves will become evil beings. With that, they're free to choose their own fate, but adding a personal note. Atu assures them their side is a lot more fun than it looks. In the next scene, while walking toward the Dark Elves tribe, Atu kept reminding Takudo to watch his step, since he was barefoot. She pointed out that, although it took some time, the Mazaram had finally agreed to become citizens of Minagra. Even though they hesitated over the idea of becoming evil, deep down, they knew from the start this was their best option. Eventually, the pair arrived at the tribe and were greeted by the people, all kneeling in respect. Some looked genuinely excited at the sight of that mysterious entity, while one elf even fainted after feeling the dark miasma swirling around him up close. Soon after, Takudo was led to a throne, and Atu formally welcomed all the Dark Elves as citizens of Minegra, which was now officially founded. From that moment on, the safety of every member of the Mazaram clan would be protected by the great king of Ruin. Still confused, Gia wondered if that was all that would happen. He'd been told that he and his companions would become evil, but he didn't feel any different. Suddenly, a deep-seated hatred welled up inside him in anger toward those who had hunted, mocked, and exiled his people from their own land. Emily felt the same way. She declared that she hated every living being in existence. The same feeling could be seen on the faces of every elf in the tribe. Amid all this, Takuto approached Gia to ask if he was alright, and the Mazaram leader realized that this, too, was a form of happiness, the joy of being cared for. Then, with tears in their eyes, all the elves greeted King Era Takuto, their enthusiasm so overwhelming that even the king himself had no idea why everyone was so worked up. Meanwhile, Atulamacenta simply smiled with pride and satisfaction. A few days after founding the nation, Takuto looked over the map of the continent that Molter had given him and muttered that he was cornered. Atu asked what was going on, and, flailing on the floor like a child throwing a tantrum, the leader complained that their kingdom had the worst possible starting position. There were already 2 major nations on the continent. To the east, the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, a human civilization devoted to the holy god Arlos, and to the west, El-Na, a kingdom of elves who worshipped nature. If either of those nations discovered their evil nation to the south, there would be nothing left, not a single stone standing, especially since Minegra was only just beginning and still incredibly weak. To make matters worse, these cursed lands didn't even have a single natural resource they could harvest. But despite all that, it wasn't only bad news. Minegra did have the homunculi as its base population. They weren't the brightest, but they were happy. And now, for the first time, the nation didn't have to rely solely on them, since the Dark Elves were part of the kingdom and could cover those weaknesses. Speaking of which, Atu's ears twitched. She announced that the elves were back again, ready to report on the outside world. Without delay, the tribal elder met with the King of Ruin, alongside the other elven leader. This time, Gia brought along his assistant, Emily, since she was smart and well-versed in legends and the ways of other nations. Turning to plans for the future, Atu revealed that the Mazaram would be assigned to key positions in Minegra's administration. Molter would oversee the state's affairs, since he could use magic and it was a position of great responsibility. Gia Najiv would lead Minegra's warriors, also taking charge of recruiting new forces. Gia enthusiastically accepted the new role and promised that, if the king commanded, he would show no mercy to any enemy and would display their impaled corpses as a warning. Hearing that, Takuto nearly soiled himself, leaving Gia genuinely puzzled. To smooth things over, Atu explained that Takuto preferred peace. With everyone's role set, Atu told the elves to get some good rest, and when they were in good health, to start building houses. Seeing that Najiv had put his foot in his mouth, Molter expressed his deepest gratitude to the king and insisted that, unlike Gia, who only took pride in his muscles, the elder would prove his worth with wisdom. Gia fired back, promising to show off his own vitality, something an old man like Molter could never match. Unsure what to say, Emily just mentioned that she'd work hard, prompting Atu to whisper to Takuto that these people seemed a little obsessed with work. Finally, she asked if she should order the gathering of resources, but Takuto suggested developing the area without destroying the forest. Hearing that, Atu turned to Elder Molter to ask if they could collect wood while keeping parts of the forest intact. The elf assured her they could. Their people had always lived in harmony with nature. Hearing this, Gia was baffled not just by how peaceful these elves could be, but also by the fact that the King of Ruin wanted to protect the flora and fauna, despite being considered evil. But that wasn't all. Era Takuto declared that his citizens should always be reforesting, though it was clear that the Dark Elves had no idea what that meant. Thinking back to the game's tech tree, Takuto guessed, based on what he'd heard so far, that the people in this world were probably at a technological level somewhere around fortress construction. Atu asked if the Dark Elves were familiar with terms like military magic and the 6 main elements. Molter replied that he knew of the 4 main elements, a basic concept in magic. Emily added that she'd never heard any other nation mention military magic, so Atu realized that this world hadn't reached the level of 6-element magic technology yet, and was behind in other areas, too. Setting that aside, the elf explained that reforestation was the practice of planting trees where they'd been harvested, in order to maintain the environment. Emily admitted this strategy wasn't part of their tradition, while the elder noted that, in reality, it took centuries for trees to mature after they've been cut down. Atu goes on to say that reforestation is a kind of technology that requires all the main elements, and that this knowledge actually comes from their mighty king era Takuto. In fact, she makes a point of letting everyone know that their king is 100 times more amazing than anyone could imagine, and Takuto can't help but feel a bit embarrassed by all the praise. Still, Atu insists that their ruler's wisdom covers countless fields, and that the people of Minagra are blessed to receive his favor. Emily asks if the apples they were given are also the king's invention, and Atu, without batting an eye, confirms they are, then casually adds that the grapes are his creation too. Speaking of which, Emily says she planted the seeds of that purple fruit and can't wait to watch them grow. At that moment, Takuto realizes he could use emergency production to create things that don't even exist in the game, like gunpowder, metals, and oil. As soon as the king notices this, the nation of Minagra is granted the divine privilege, the ruler's ability to produce anything he knows about, with the mana costs varying based on how complex the item is. Check out these videos appearing on your screen and subscribe so you don't miss the next part.